that if they take something from somebody else, they cry when you punish them, but typically they understand the punishment. They don't say, "Mom, Dad, I have a whole philosophical argument against why you're punishing me." They know in their heart they've done something wrong. Well, we have these senses of what is right and wrong. We also have the Ten Commandments in our own tradition. But according to Vittoria, the Ten Commandments are really spelling out principles that practically any people, really, if they reflect long enough, will understand and appreciate. And because we all possess this kind of sense of right and wrong, a basic sense, then this basic sense can become the basis for international rules of conduct. And these rules of conduct can morally bind even those who've never heard the gospel, or never heard of the Ten Commandments, or had even rejected the gospel, because we're basing ourselves on the idea that we all ultimately know that sheer conquest is wrong, and looting and pillaging is wrong. We know this because God has imprinted it on our hearts, and this becomes the basis for a common understanding of international obligation. Now, that is to say that peoples, such as the peoples of the New World, were thought to possess this basic sense of right and wrong, summed up in the Ten Commandments and in the Golden Rule, and so we could interact with them on the understanding that they understand these principles, but we have to understand and live according to them too. So what this means is that in the 16th century, Spanish theologians looked at the behavior of their own civilization. They held it up to critical scrutiny, and they found it wanting. They looked and said, "We have failed to live up to the absolute moral standard that binds all people." They proposed that in matters of natural right, the other peoples of the world were their equals, and that the commonwealths even of pagan peoples were entitled to the same treatment that the nations of Christian Europe accorded to one another. Now that is something extraordinary in the history of the world, and we in no way wish to make light of what happened to the peoples in the New World, because many of them perished, sometimes in terrible circumstances, oftentimes due to disease, a non-volitional source, sometimes due to overwork, and it was something terrible in some ways, what happened to a great many of these people. But the very fact that the Spaniards could step back and say, "My people have failed to live up to an absolute standard," is something new in the world. A historian named Louis Hankey wrote a book called "The Spanish Struggle for Justice in the Conquest of America." Now that's a strange title, isn't it? But what he's talking about is precisely what we've seen here. The Spanish theologians attempt to devise rules that would bind everybody and that would establish justice in the world. And their ability, the Spaniards' ability to look objectively at these foreign peoples and recognize their common humanity, was no small achievement. In fact, this type of impartiality, this ability to look at the peoples of the world and be willing to apply the same rules to other peoples that you apply to your own, and that you would abide by the same rules that you expect others to abide by. This impartiality is not exactly embedded in every civilization. In fact, we need look no further, for example, than the American Indian cultures, which, for whatever their merits, did not possess the ability to look impartially at the world and hold themselves up to a common moral standard. The Harvard historian Samuel Eliot Morison said that the Indians of the same region or language group did not even have a common name for themselves, and that each tribe called itself something like "we the people" and referred to its neighbors by a word that meant "the barbarians" or "sons of she-dog" or something equally insulting. Well, if that's your view, that you are the people and everybody else are the barbarians or sons of the she-dog, how are you going to be able to come up with impartial rules governing both you and the barbarians? It's not going to happen. So the idea of an international order of states, some large, some small, of varying levels of civilization and refinement, operating on a principle of equality, one toward the other, this could not have found fertile ground amid that kind of narrow chauvinism, a kind of chauvinism that has been all too prevalent in the history of the world. So it's thanks to the Catholic conception of the fundamental unity of the human race that we're able to think in terms of universal principles governing all peoples. So when we criticize Spanish excesses in the New World, therefore, it's largely thanks to the moral tools provided by the Catholic theologians of Spain itself that we're able to do so. The Peruvian poet Mario Vargas Llosa, when he spoke about these Spanish critics of their own government's policy, he said this: "They fought against their fellow men and against the policies of their own country in the name of a moral principle that to them was higher than any principle of nation or state." This self-determination, this capacity for criticism of your own civilization could not have been possible among the Incas or any of the other pre-Hispanic cultures. In these cultures, as in the other great civilizations of history foreign to the West, the individual could not morally question the social organism of which he was a part. Well, let's conclude now by saying that we have seen that, in theory, the Catholic Church has set up and established and defended these universal moral principles. And perhaps they have been observed in the breach at times, but these are the principles. And the additional principle, of course, is that there's to be no forced conversion. That's in canon law. All these things are Catholic principles. What we're going to see next time is an aspect of modern history that's often been forgotten, when anti-Catholic or atheistic states in effect establish the opposite principle, that people have the opposite of rights because they're Catholic. Because they're Catholic, they can be imprisoned or tortured or killed. And we are once again going to see this glorious witness of Catholics in the face of devastation. Join me for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization.